So, number one, LSU at Alabama. And a lot of this game, Steven, is how I feel, like how I vision I have these visions of what the game could look like. And I see a lot of Alabama receivers running wide open through the LSU secondary, and like the LSU defensive player is not in the frame. Like, that's a concern for me. I also see Harold Perkins and Mason Smith and the defensive front getting pressure on Jalen Milroe, because Alabama always allows pressure on Jalen Milroe, and Jalen Milroe having to run around. Can Tommy Rees design some run plays? I think that's critical in this situation. But here's the other thing. Brian Thomas and Malik Nabers are elite. They are dynamic weapons. They're as good a weapons as possible. I don't think that the Alabama secondary is going to make plays the entire game. But unlike that vision I have of Alabama's receivers running 12 yards open through the LSU secondary, just like they have, by the way, the entire season, both for LSU's defense and for Alabama's receivers, I at least assume that Alabama's defensive players will be in the picture and in the right place. They may not make all the plays, but Arnold, for example, he gives up some plays, pass interference, touchdown, but he's always in the right place. So I think Alabama's defense, I think their secondary is a huge advantage. LSU's missing 3 of their top 4 corners. I don't want to oversimplify this entire thing, but I truly think it comes down to, does Jayden Daniels put himself atop the Heisman Trophy conversation by doing something special off script and having that moment that we all know about in November on the road against Alabama's defense, and he does something special with his legs out of the pocket that wins them the game? Or are all these visions of how this game plays out in my head completely wrong?
I think one of my storylines for this game is going to be how this game starts, because I think the style of play could be important here. We've seen Alabama get off to a slow start against Tennessee. They were able to come back. I think if they fall behind against LSU, 20-7 or 17-0, it might LSU's defense is clearly not very good, but the combination of Jayden Daniels and that offense, it may be a little bit harder to play catch up. So I think Alabama's consistency over the 4 quarters, it really hasn't been there at times this year. They're going to need a better consistent effort in this one to beat LSU. But really, this, like, to your point, the matchup kind of boils down to, you have Jayden Daniels and the high-powered LSU receivers against an Alabama secondary that's been good. Texas showed you can hit some plays on them, though, back in September. And then the other side of things is LSU's secondary, which is very beat up in terms of injuries. Can they find a way to limit the big plays? And these two teams at the line of scrimmage, I think if you're LSU, you don't have Mekhi Wingo. You're going to need an effort out of Mason Smith. Some of those guys, Brian Kelly has talked about, they have to get the defensive line going. They did better against Army. They did better against Auburn. This is a little tougher challenge, though. So we'll see about LSU's defensive improvement over the last 3 weeks or so. Is there something there, or was it just the opponent? I think if you're LSU, you're willing to live up with some small plays in hopes that you don't give up the big play to Milroe and those receivers. So maybe a little bend, but don't break. I think if you're LSU, to your point, this is the Jayden Daniels game. If they go into Tuscaloosa and win, like last year, he connected on the 2-point play. He was excellent in that game. He goes into Tuscaloosa and has a huge day.
You said, can they limit, bend, don't break, keep the big play from happening? I guess, like, this is where, like, both things have no team has stopped Alabama from doing that the entire season, and LSU has stopped no teams from doing that against their secondary. So I don't know why this would be the moment, because of all the things that Jalen Milroe does well for Alabama. It is deep shots down the field. It is Tommy Rees is deserving of the questioning that he is getting right now. The criticism he's getting is all worthy. Design some plays for your 4-4 quarterback. How about to run the football? But you cannot argue how and when they have schemed those receivers open on those deep shots. It has worked every single week against defenses way, way better than Tennessee. And here's the other thing. I agree with your point about the 4 quarters for Alabama. They were down against Tennessee, much better defense than LSU. They're down, not playing elite football against Texas A&M. What did they do in the second half of both those games? They came out and absolutely dominated on defense. Now, can you do that against Jayden Daniels and LSU? Probably not. But I don't see a way in which LSU gets stops. The only way it happens is if Harold Perkins is like spying Jalen Milroe and they force him and they play like a 3 deep shell coverage where like they are forcing him to make quick decisions and he has to throw intermediate routes. But you know what Tennessee kind of did? They kind of made him throw those intermediate routes and they won the game, not only because they hit the deep shot to Bond to start the second half, but because they also hit Burton on those dig routes across the middle. He actually hit the intermediate routes. So I just don't know how LSU, like there's not a matchup in which I like LSU. And that's probably a reason to pick LSU. But this is a home game. Saban has earned his money in the second half. They did not against Arkansas. That was the one game where the second half they were not very good. I don't know. Who you got?
I think, well, first of all, I think to your point on Jalen Milroe, I think he's played a lot better, I think, since he settled into the starting job. Like after the South Florida game, I think he's gotten a lot more confident. I think he's been a lot more just comfortable. And I think he's progressed a lot. And maybe we probably should be giving him just more credit in general. But I do think
he's gotten better as the season has gone along.
Yeah.
Sure.
And still dealing with an offensive line that's struggling, a run game that seems to be very hit or miss for Alabama. So I think if you're LSU, maybe the matchup you can try to win is on early downs. If your defensive front wins, like you said, Harold Perkins creates some negative plays, 3rd and 8, 3rd and 7, 3rd and 9. If Alabama wins those situations and Milroe has done that, then I think that's still your best path of defense. And I think just not giving up the big plays. I also think too the mobility of both quarterbacks here, because I think both teams can create some negative plays around the line of scrimmage. We talked about Jayden Daniels and Dallas Turner in that Alabama defensive front. They're going to be in the backfield. Like, can you escape? Can you make some throws on the run? Same thing for Milroe. So to me, Alabama is probably a more complete team that we know of right now because of LSU's defensive issues. If LSU's defense was a little bit better, I was prepared to pick LSU a few weeks ago. The spread in this game dropped from 7-8 all the way down to 3. A lot of people coming in on LSU. I just think in a game like this, if you trust one defense, I think it's pretty clear. I think it's Alabama, despite how much I like the way Jayden Daniels and these receivers are playing for LSU.
I'm going to use this in just a minute on the show about Texas, so stay tuned. But I think the reason LSU wins the game, outside of something special from Jayden Daniels, just his Heisman game where he does 400, and Caleb Williams has that game against Notre Dame last year. Lamar Jackson has that game against Florida State. We see guys do this all the time where they win the Heisman because of a moment, a game, a performance, a situation, and that certainly could happen for Jayden Daniels in this game, and that's the reason they could win. The other reason that LSU could win, and this is very vague and this is very hard to pinpoint, that if Alabama just isn't as good as we've expected, like this whole the questions about the big picture future of the program, they're just not that good. They're not. They trail against Tennessee. They have to go to war against the middle of the pack Texas A&M team. They lose to Texas at home. The penalties, LSU's just better. LSU's just the better football team. They pressure Jalen Milroe the whole time. Their quarterbacks and receivers and running game is more consistent and better on offense, and they outscore Alabama a la Joe Burrow 2019. They're just better. That, to me, that is the argument for LSU. And I know that's very vague and hard to explain, but they're just the better, more complete football team. I don't think that's true. I'm picking Alabama, but that is, to me, that's the weird sort of nebulous argument for LSU. They're just flat out better.
I think some credit to Alabama for just finding ways to win this year. To your point, they are a flawed team. They are not as good as they were in the past, but they just keep finding ways to win, and they've gotten a little bit better during the course of the season. Maybe the off week, having 2 weeks to get ready, maybe there's some new stuff Reese and Milroe can throw out there. But, I mean, last year's game was a classic. It wouldn't surprise me if this one goes down to the wire as well. But I like Alabama.
I'll take the Tide. Roll Tide.